God, most gracious, most merciful. We will start in a few minutes. So please, if you need translation into English, you can use the headset. Make sure that it is on channel 1. Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon. My name is Sultan Barakat. I'm the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. It is a great pleasure to welcome you here at the center today in order to have this roundtable, a special roundtable. Usually we broadcast most of our seminars and our roundtables and our panels. Now, in this case, we will be broadcasting live via social media platform of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. We will be broadcasting the first half of this roundtable, which is the introduction and the speech of His Excellency Mr. Ramon, and then we will stop the broadcasting, and then we will be able to discuss together comfortably. And you can notice that this is a small group of people, a chosen group of people, selected for different reasons, in order for us to delve deep into the discussion when it comes to the mediation. Everybody knows that the UN Charter, Article 33, encouraged the use of peaceful means in order to find resolutions to conflicts, particularly conflicts with regional damages and ramifications via mediation. And the mediation is actually one of the tools and instruments of diplomacy, and it is increasing in its importance and level year after year, and many countries reiterated the importance of mediation as one of its main pillars of foreign policy. And today we are with two important figures. The first, our dear colleague, His Excellency Mr. Ramon Blecua from Spain, and I will be introducing him shortly. He is the ambassador at large for mediation and intercultural dialogue in the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he will be the keynote speaker today. And it is our great pleasure and honor to welcome the friend and brother, His Excellency Dr. Mutlaq Al-Qahtani, the Special Envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar, when it comes to mediation. And it is also an occasion to celebrate Dr. Mutlaq through our discussion today, as he received the award of the Best Negotiator. The Best Negotiator award. He was awarded by the United Nations last week, 10 days ago actually, and this award was in recognition of Doctor's role in mediation, not only during the latest mediation between the Afghan parties, but also his endeavors aiming at building peace over the years. And he is also he received the award of the Ambassador of Peace in the past before coming back to Doha. It is a great pleasure and honor to have him with us today. In addition to that, before introducing our keynote speaker, I would like to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors in Doha, particularly Sister Fatma Al Gailani and Your Excellency Minister Rahimi from Afghanistan, and they are part of the negotiating team between Kabul and Taliban, hosted by Doha. His Excellency Ramon Blecua, as I have said previously, is currently Ambassador at Large for Mediation and Intercultural Dialogue at the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was the EU Ambassador to Iraq and head of the political section of the European Union delegation to Yemen. Previously, he was also deputy head of mission in the Spanish embassy in New Delhi. He held several postings in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the embassies of Spain and Ghana, Indonesia, Egypt, Guatemala from 1988 to 1996. And he was also a subsequent or chief of cabinet and the director of the Cervantes Institute, deputy head of mission in Tehran, deputy consul general in Buenos Aires, and cultural counselor in Cairo. He was also the Spanish representative to Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations in Cairo from 1992 to 1995, and he participated in the International Commission on Security Sector Reform of Guatemala as Cooperation Aid Coordinator for implementation of the peace agreements. He is a frequent speaker at institutes and universities all over the world and has published articles and essays on international relations, development cooperation, and cultural diplomacy. And I had the honor of meeting Mr. Ramon 6 years ago, approximately, and we have a project that is still going in Yemen, or there was a project still going in Yemen as a result of his efforts, and also the track 2 in Iraq, where he laid the foundation of this project as well, and also doing the follow-up. So today we will give His Excellency 15 to 20 minutes in order for him to clarify the main objectives and his point of view when it comes to the subject of our roundtable today. And then we will have a closed session of questions and dialogue. The floor is yours, sir. شكرا جزيلا سلطان على هذه المقدمة الكريمة. أود أن أتشكر الدكتور مطلق القحطاني على دعوته الكريمة إلى دولة قطر من أجل إجراء هذه المناقشات المثمرة، وأود أن أهنئه على هذه الجائزة المستحقة.
Of the year. And to be honest with you, I had been, or my professional career has been woven with conflict resolution, peace negotiations since pretty much the very beginning. So for some strange reason, this seems to be a path that was put in my way, and it has brought me now to Qatar, in which I certainly not going to teach you much, but I certainly need to listen a lot to what is being done here, not only by Dr. Sultan Barakat and Dr. Motlaq Al-Qahtani, but also by you who are actually working on the ground and trying to make the world a better place. I think that mediation is certainly the area in international relations that has more dramatic and deep changes in the last few years. All the main players and institutions that are international actors in mediation are at this moment redefining their strategies, studying the lessons learned in the past decade, and trying to figure out why certain things have been effective, why others haven't, and how to face this new period of instability, unrestricted warfare, and expanded conflict. Because the truth is that conflicts are on the rise. There's growing inequalities. There's more fear. There's more instability. The international multilateral system is being challenged. International legitimacy is eroded. State sovereignty is diminished. And there are many new players in the international arena that are either difficult to control or that have not found their place and become sometimes agents of unpredictable change or spoilers in the process. Why did I choose this theme or this subject when I speak of hybrid mediation and new instruments? Is because the complexity of modern conflicts have made traditional peacemaking, intergovernmental diplomacy, or the multilateral approach of the UN-led processes quite ineffective. And we have seen how many of these negotiations have not worked out. And from the peace process, the Middle East peace process that started in Madrid in 1991 and is about to achieve its 30th year, to many other negotiations, I think peacemakers or mediators have to ponder and consider why this has been the case and what kind of new instruments or new ideas have to be put on the table. The fact that the new international order could be defined as a polyarchy in which big power competition and conflict is increasing, and in which the instability of this period to come is going to be another factor that increases conflict and violence, extremism, and populism, and all sorts of destructive forces that will challenge international peace and stability. We may have to live in a system in which the rule-based multilateral order is eroded, and where there will be the need to deal with these increasingly more powerful non-state actors. Now, and when I say non-state actors, I'm not only talking about militias or about the traditional armed groups that have been considered the main elements of instability and conflict. I'm talking about transnational financial corporations, of which the digital platforms, the big tech, are probably the most important development. These days, 80% of international capitalization goes to only 10% of companies or business or enterprises, of which the big tech are taking the lion's share and most of it. That is another factor that increases inequality. The internet was created as a way of democratizing knowledge, giving access to everybody of unrestricted information. And we are realizing that what is being created now are extremely powerful platforms that have their own business interests, that have turned big data into the most important commodity of our times, and in which the access to this technology is becoming increasingly unequal. And so the power relations that are being generated by this new digital economy and this new digital order are also another source of conflict. And we have seen that this is not anymore restricted to fragile states or countries that are facing protracted conflicts. This is happening in Washington, D.C., as we could see last January. This is happening in France, it's happening in Denmark, it's happening in Nordic countries, it's happening all over the place. From Hong Kong to Chile, there is a new wave of instability, of insatisfaction, of wave of protests that mirror what happened in the Middle East in 2011, when we could see not just another struggle for power, another competition within or among the elites for replacing either autocrats or the existing regimes, but a deep systemic crisis in which the social contract is in question, in which citizens do not feel any more represented, and in which there's a growing sense of fear, of uncertainty, and increasingly anger, hatred, intolerance. I think that those who now, and especially among the populists, so the populist movements that question this, the Western-inspired liberal or multilateral system, as we can call it or define it, and defend that we have to go back to the safety of state sovereignty. They don't have either a recipe, or they don't have a solution, because that world does not exist anymore. They are trying to use it as a mythical reference or as an emotional flag, but in reality, that does not exist. What is happening is that, and we've seen that, for example, with the experience of Daesh, the creation of new narratives through the fault lines of identity, trying to basically recreate what is the cultural heritage of people, and to use it to basically redesign the future. And I think there's a lot of players in this game, and we cannot anymore be absent. I mean, mediators and peace builders, they cannot ignore the fact that artificial intelligence, big data, and digital platforms are now the main elements in modern conflict. We need to bring, I think, a completely new approach, a much more culturally sensitive approach. It is true that mediation has done enormous progress, and countries leading in mediation, such as Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, and now there are other European players. The European Union in 2016 defined in its global strategy that the main objective of European diplomacy had to be crisis management and conflict resolution. And for that reason, it actually developed a whole new set of tools, financial instruments, extremely effective ones, in contrast with the general impression that the European Union is slow in decision-making and extremely complicated in implementation. I have to tell you that as EU ambassador, I could realize how effective and fast these instruments can be when they are applied with the integrated approach in which member states and the EU institutions work hand in hand, and when the nexus between the humanitarian, the stabilization, and post-conflict reconstruction are actually joined together. I think this has been a tremendous improvement that has taken place in recent years. Now there is the new discussion for the new EU financial instruments for the next 5 years, and there is a whole debate about how we have to adapt the former concept or methodological framework to these new conditions. I think I would like to give you an example. When we were involved in the negotiations for the Yemen peace process in Kuwait City, the US asked the European Union to implement the conflicting committees and the whole structure of the monitoring of the ceasefire and the implementation of the military agreements. We were surprised because, well, for the US to ask the European Union, it will seem to be the world upside down. It's like the other way around. Normally, the Europeans are always asking the Americans to come and sort out their problems in troubled spots. But there was a reason for it, because in 2 weeks, we could actually put together the whole structure, bring Yemenis from inside, with the great help of Oman at that time, and have everybody there ready at the negotiating table. And one of the most important lessons for me, after quite a long experience in this kind of negotiations, and always thinking how we can actually bring our expertise in peacemaking and in negotiations to countries in conflict, how the two Yemeni delegations, and they were military, mostly integrated by military personnel, that were fighting on the ground. And when we asked them to prepare their proposals according to a script that we have given them, a kind of framework, both of them actually told us that they will give us not two proposals, they will give us one proposal, because they were going to meet that evening together, and they were going to agree on how best to actually move this forward. Well, I think in this case, probably the mediated were mediating with the mediators that were in a much more complex situation, in which between the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Americans, the Europeans, the British, and actually much more unruly than the Yemenis were in their approach. So the use of traditional conflict resolution mechanisms that sometimes is looked upon with certain disdain, or at least condescending, in a condescending manner, sometimes have an extraordinary value in these kind of processes. I also have a distinctive memory. My first experience in real serious negotiation was during the Palestinian-Israeli talks that were taking place in Cairo throughout 93 and 94 until the Palestinian Authority was actually set up. And Spain was giving technical support for the Palestinian delegation, some expertise on constitutional matters, on legal affairs. And that's why, well, we were also sitting at the table. I was there with the Spanish expert. And I still remember certain amazing moments in which General Ramon was discussing with Sultan Barakat. They were the two heads of the delegation. So there were moments in which they will stop the clock, relax, have some coffee, and how they were discussing in one of these occasions that I was present, a certain assassination operation that the Israeli special forces led by Ramon Blecua tried on Saeb Erekat. And how Saeb Erekat was describing how they ambushed the Israeli forces in Beirut and nearly killed Ramon Blecua. And then they continue negotiations. But you could feel that sometimes those fighting in the battlefield develop a much deeper respect for each other than politicians that sit sometimes far from the blood and from the war and from the violence. So I think once Michael Keating said in a presentation for the European Union that mediation is an art. And mediation is an art because no matter how much technical skill we put into it, it needs heart, it needs intuition, it needs compassion, it needs understanding. And those are qualities that are not taught. These are qualities that one has to learn. And I think that this emotional dimension of conflict needs to be also factored in. It's true that the scientific approach has given extraordinarily effective tools, and it's true that this sort of what they call the Swiss school or the Harvard models have given mediators extremely powerful instruments. But I think there is much more than that, and I think that that is what makes mediation such a subtle and profound experience. I think when I was talking here with my colleague, with Dr. Motlak, and he was describing some of the ways that they were approaching certain critical moments in negotiations when you don't know why things are not working. I mean, why everything should be there and it doesn't happen. I was very pleased to hear that how he has this sort of approach, this sort of culturally sensitive approach, this understanding for the interlocutor, how trying to not have this sort of sense of moral superiority because you are the mediator and you are dealing with people that are killing each other, but reaching this sort of understanding, that is what makes things happen. I do believe that often what is needed is to create a conducive environment. There's a lot that has to be done in terms of preparation. It's a complex process. But the importance of addressing these personal issues, these personal elements are essential. I think Qatar has been doing a tremendous work here in developing wide networks of contacts. And then try not to be judgmental about the moral qualities of those who sometimes come into the table. That doesn't mean that the mediator is neutral. It's absolutely neutral, because obviously everybody has certain approach, likes and dislikes. And I don't think that it will be human to pretend that we are not. But what is essential is for the mediator not to judge, not to be judgmental, not to have this approach of sort of moral superiority, as we were saying. And sometimes even with the best of intentions, you can actually be damaging the climate you are trying to create. I was married to a Palestinian for 17 years, and I had my training on that field because sometimes I was discussing, and we were discussing, and I remember we had discussions about the Palestinian peace process and how things were. And she was extremely political and extremely bright, American educated.
This is being broadcast, this section.
I know.
Okay.
It's okay. She won't mind. I don't think she would mind. And sometimes she would actually point at me like, you know, that you're again using this sort of, how would you call it, Orientalist attitude. And I thought, I am the least Orientalist of all people I know. But what she meant is probably like, you think you know best. And you are talking from that perspective. And it doesn't matter you have the best of intentions. So I think, I know this is going a little off track in terms of what probably Dr. Barakat was expecting of me. A much more let's say, structured presentation. But I think for me, this whole experience, you know, starting from the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, then I moved to Guatemala, and I was deeply involved in the negotiations that led to this time a successful agreement, and then to the implementation of a plan for state reform, for institutional strengthening, for national reconciliation, that surprisingly had some unexpected progress in many different areas. Spain and Mexico were the main facilitators in that process, and the agreements signed in I think it was February '96 were the first in Central America to break that deadly cycle of blood and violence, the dirty war, and the counterinsurgency policies that really had made tremendous damage to the countries involved. That particular process, I think, had some important lessons for me, in the sense that the local agenda has to be put in front of the recipes that we may develop. At that time, Douglas North had made all this groundbreaking theory of the cost of the collapse of state institutions in terms of not only of peace dividends or social stability, but also for the economy. The economic cost of uncertainty and of lack of rules. I think we have to look back into the previous narrative. There was the Chicago School. It was the less state, the better. Private enterprise can do things better and can actually make the markets prosper. And this actually was a very much needed correction, because market operates ideally in, the model describes market operating ideally in a perfect situation in which every actor has the same information. What is never the case. And then every actor has equal access to resources, to legal and political power, and that's why there's a need for the institutional framework. And peace agreements often fail by not addressing the need of those structures to actually implement whatever is agreed by the parties. There are two things that, in my view, are critical. One is something that is often disregarded, because when you study conflict analysis, then it's always the drivers of conflict that are taken into account. Drivers of conflict have to do with the previous situation before the conflict. What made the conflict happen? Inequality, vengeance, access to resources, ethnic or sectarian hatred or violence or resentment. But it disregards two things. First, that conflict creates its own dynamics. and it creates its own economy. And the fighters or the actors that start a conflict for one reason may end up keeping it going for very different reasons, because they actually are making great profits out of it. The war economy is one of the most unstudied factors in peace building. I actually, during my time in Iraq, developed a project with Chatham House to actually bring that model into the conflict analysis. Because in all the conflict analysis I was participating, it was like a still life image of the conflict before, not of what actually was the reality. Like those militias in Iraq that had started fighting Daesh were not fighting anymore for the same reason. They had become actual warlords with economic interest, access to resources, oil, taxes, roadblocks, whatever, you name it, smuggling. So you are trying to address a conflict that does not longer exist. It's actually a different conflict, the one you have in front of you. And the second thing is the leap of faith. How many times an agreement does not happen, even when it is technically perfect? When the parties said, yes, we agree, this is what we need. And it's because there's no trust. And to address the leap of faith is that, I think, one of the main objectives of a mediator, and is the most difficult. How you make people trust. How would they be ready to risk everything to actually put that agreement in motion? And this is a question to which I don't have an answer. I mean, I think this is what really makes the difference in a skillful mediator. I think in Spain we have a lot of shortcomings and flaws, and we are not particularly easygoing with ourselves, and we are sometimes a bit unruly, and jealousy is supposed to be our national sin. But I think there's something Spaniards do well, and is that kind of capacity to create trust and to create an environment in which people feel at home. Because Spain has been at the fault line of so many cultural and historical conflicts. We've been part of the Arab Islamic world. We've been part of the European empires, and we have been part of the largest empire the world has seen with Latin America at the time. Those three multi-layer levels of Spanish history maybe have provided us with a capacity to connect different cultural systems like no other country. Spain is still known as the country of the three cultures, where Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultures thrived and had this sort of cross-cultural fertilization that was at the root of the European Renaissance, translation from the classics and most important texts that were then the root of European scientific and philosophical advancement, were translated from Arabic into Hebrew and into Latin in the city of Toledo. And those golden years of Al-Andalus or Sepharad are still remembered, despite of the fact that there was a lot of bitter blood. You have to finish? Okay. Well, let's then focus a bit on a more let's say, professional approach, because I think I wouldn't like to finish without addressing what are we doing now? Why Spain is now trying to join and partner with other like-minded countries in developing new tools for mediation that will respond to this kind of extremely challenging environment we are going to be facing. And I think that within, of course, the European Union framework, that is our main reference and is our, let's say, toolbox and our financial muscle in most of these projects. We have been actually advocating that mediation needs this more hybrid approach. It needs to incorporate other elements that traditionally have not been part of the political conflict resolution toolbox. One of them is the importance of cultural heritage, because cultural heritage is a point of connection, a point of entry in the conflict cycle that immediately resonates with the parties in the conflict, that immediately touches their sense of belonging, the sense of identity, their sense of community, what makes them feel they belong to a certain community as such. And it certainly helps creating this trust, this sort of bonding, we could call it. And we are actually proposing a conference to launch an initiative that is quite innovative, that is we call it the Toledo Platform for Cultural Heritage and Conflict Resolution, because of the symbolic value, the symbolic importance, because Toledo remains that symbolic city in which tolerance and intellectual ferment have been created. We also try to incorporate artificial intelligence, big data, and digital tools in our conflict resolution strategies, because if it is part of the conflict, if it is being used extensively by different actors to fuel or increase or sometimes wreck the stability in a particular country, to bring down governments, to attack certain groups, to promote violence, they have to be also incorporated to the solution. They have to be incorporated to the management of misinformation, the misuse of social media. Another element I think that we cannot forget is environmental peace building. The environment is also a battlefield, is also part of conflict, also increases difficulty in access to resources, deprives communities of their livelihood, pushes people to migrate. The environment, we all talk about global warming, we all talk about it in abstract, as if it was something that will happen from the North Pole and then it will affect all our rich countries because water is going to come up. But conflict is being fueled by this in the Sahel. There are many regions in the world in which environmental changes are actually pushing conflict. I was talking once to a Syrian who was telling me that before 2011, there was a tremendous drought in the country. There was that had a huge impact on the mood, on the stability, on the social contract, on the movement of peasants and farmers to the cities, that upset the already fragile balance on which the Syrian regime was living. I don't say that that was the cause of what happened in 2011, but certainly was a factor that made that flare much more serious. And of course, women, peace and security agenda. I mean, it's not new. It's been already in the agenda for long. United Nations had resolutions. Spain is proposing Initiative 2025 with Finland to actually make it more operational. But the fact that this has been included, and we have seen that it had an impact in the way negotiations and peacemaking is being addressed, has not been really fully developed, has not been sometimes completely incorporated as something that is very clear. I mean, not only women are 50% or 51 or whatever of the population, They also are sometimes those who preserve traditions, who preserve knowledge, who preserve heritage, who can actually bring a different kind of approach. Because we may say it or not, but at the end of the day, men try to do things that women find acceptable. The question is what women make them believe. Sometimes women are the ones who push men to war. They're not always peacemakers. But I think women, if they become aware of their role, they also will play a much more positive. And I think probably I talk already too much. I think Sultan is already winking at me. And I think probably we can discuss these matters more thoroughly throughout the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramon.
شكرا جزيلا لك رامون. طبعا مداخلتك ونقاطك التي ذكرتها قيمة للغاية ومهمة للغاية، وإذا أتحتم لي بعض الوقت القصير لكي أقدم إعادة تعطير مفهومي لما قلته، فنحن نعيش الآن في وقت يختلف عما بدأنا بالمرحلة التي خط بها ميثاق الأمم المتحدة. نحن نعيش في عالم تعمه الفوضى.
Hybrid conflicts, things are not necessarily as organized as we'd like them to see. And it seems to me what you're trying to do in Spain is to propose that we should have a much more complex approach to mediation, and not necessarily as clean as the clinical approach. That actually a lot of the Harvard thinking and so on came from management fields. It did not come from conflict resolution. It was about adaptive leadership training, mediation in corporate conflicts and so on, to something that addresses culture much more seriously, accepts personalities and emotions into the process, but most interestingly, I think, the idea of this hybrid intervention, where you're suggesting that we should not just mediate as a third party who is distant from the two sides, but also there is a space to use other instruments like relief, rehabilitation, even reconstruction as part of the mediation approach from the very start. I think this is all very interesting, and it is very important to learn that the EU has now devised a new approach. This was only last year?
It was actually adopted by the Council for Foreign Affairs on the 7th of December, so it's very, very fresh.
Okay, and that framework includes 4 what they see as innovative instruments or entry points where warring parties has a greater chance to come together over, and these include environmental issues, cultural heritage, I think this is very interesting, big data, and of course women, which has already been on the agenda for a while, but it remains one of the 4 approaches for the EU. Thank you very much for this. I would like now to ask the broadcast to cut the broadcast. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for those who are following us online.